Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm John Freeman, author of The Park.
Woo! That was very good. I think you missed a preposition in there. I'm not going to give you 100% grade on that, John.
I'm an editor, man. I'm going to edit on the fly.
I think we should have every guest do that. And they can also write the episode scripts and read all the books and do the transcription.
Oh, I'm willing to do that. Wait a second. That'd be doing your job.
Sugi, that was a nice try. I don't think that's going to work.
I think does he have enough projects though? I'm not sure if he does. I think he should add to his portfolio. It would not be surprising if he also worked on a podcast, but somehow I am one of the co-hosts of this podcast and sadly John is not. I am VV Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I am Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And John Freeman, our buddy, is one of the most talented, hardworking, and up until COVID-19, peripatetic writers in the United States or maybe the world. He is the editor of Freeman's Literary Annual of New Writing and multiple anthologies, including Tales of Two Planets, Stories of Climate Change and Inequality in a Divided World. Maps, his debut collection of poems, was published in 2017. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages and has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the New York Times. And he's here to talk to us about that new anthology and his new collection of poems, The Park. John, welcome to the show.
It's really nice to be back.
John, it is so good to see you, even distantly. You remember me editing your last appearance on the show as we drove down to Wichita on I-35 to do an event with Sarah Smarsh at Watermark Books?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think your studio conditions have improved vastly. No longer in your car.
I remember I was like, does this sound tinny? And you were like, yeah, it does, but it's okay. It's all right. I didn't know how to fix it. We figured out a thing called a de-esser now that helps quite a bit with the sound.
No sibilance?
Yeah.
There's really nothing like road editing with Whitney. It strikes me that the interstate and the road in general, not my favorite place for editing, is a particularly American kind of public space. And maybe in the age of COVID, one of the few left. But your book thinks about public space in terms of a very different location, the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. So why did you choose that public space and not, say, I-35 between Kansas City and Wichita?
Well, the honest and direct answer there is that I no longer have a driver's license. So I could do that in a taxi perhaps, or in my dad's car, but he lives in Sacramento and I mostly take public transportation. And so for me, public space is the sidewalk, is the street, are parks, where I spend a lot of my time. And for part of the year I live and teach in Paris. And in 2016, after this election started really ramping up, I feel like the discourse about what public space is and who's allowed to be there took a very violent notch upward in terms of who can be left out and why. And a park to me became a kind of refuge from that kind of conversation. And so I would go into Luxembourg Gardens in January when I was staying there, and June and July and August, and I would see people agreeing to get along, to not bother each other. I would see people of all sort of ages and races sitting near one another, doing the things that you do, sometimes in private, like kissing and eating a meal, or sometimes reading a book. But I also saw people hiding in the park. I saw people kicked out of the park. And so just as quickly as I tried to make the park a utopia, it reasserted that all the things that I wanted to correct in our public life or wished were different were inside the park too. And so it became a kind of fascinating study for me of the ways that our civilizations work, that they have this tension between inclusion and exclusion, between mendacity and generosity.
I was thinking a lot about public space. And in fact, the other night I was watching Fellini's film 8.5. I don't know if you're familiar with that movie. It's about a movie about a filmmaker. It's set in Italy, but of course, Italy had this terrible coronavirus outbreak, and so the movie read totally differently to me. There's a scene very early on where the main character Guido is asked to go take a holy water cure, and he everyone's lined up in this like plaza, close together, and I was like, oh my God, I can't even imagine that now. And it was so strange. Like, and I wonder, is this, since you wrote this book, do you go to public parks? Do they feel different? What's that been like in the age of COVID-19?
I do actually. I have been running on the west side of Manhattan, down from where I am in Chelsea to the tip of the island and back. But it's actually become too crowded. So I now run inside a park that's in a housing development not far from me, for affordable housing, which is a wonderful development because it means that you can walk from 28th Street to 23rd without walking on an avenue. And the housing development is also full of trees and benches. And so you see walking through there all sorts of families. And this track is part of that development. And so people tend to be very cautious and respectful. They're not zipping by you an inch from your face. There's no people, no one's on a bicycle.
Is that on the East River? Is that
It's on the west side.
Oh, the west side. Okay. I used to jog on the east side around that area.
Yeah, no, that's nice over there too. But this is 28th Street between 9th and 10th Avenues.
Open public space is incredibly important because that's one of the safest places you can be, other than alone inside your house. That the disease doesn't transmit in space in the way that it does inside. And so that changed. I mean, Kansas City doesn't have enough parks, in my view, and our parks are crowded. And you suddenly think, oh my God, we need more space. I wrote a post the other day about criticizing the private golf courses and asking them, like, hey, why don't you guys? Boy, everybody got mad about that. But I mean, it's so much dead space. They could be helping people, and that's the difference between public space and private space.
Well, we're creatures of sense, and the last 2 months or so, we've been asked to live without the sense of touch. Obviously at home you can be part of that, but when you go into public space, that sense is activated, and that doesn't mean you're running around patting people on the back and hugging strangers. The city touches you. Wind blows across your face. You run underneath a tree, and there's a sense of shade, and your skin gets cooler, and all of those feelings, I think, activate a creatureliness within us, which I have no data on this, but I feel like makes us a tiny bit kinder to each other. And I feel like we need that sense of touch in order to exist in a kind of larger theoretical space, such as a city or a state or a nation, if we're ever going to be addressed as members of those theoretical states.
When I think about what's going on in here in Minneapolis, I hear I've been outside, I think a lot less than a lot of other people, and my friends who have gone outside have talked about inadequate social distancing here. We have a ton of green space and a ton of parks. And also the city of Minneapolis actually shut down a major parkway alongside a lake because they thought there wasn't enough public space and that people were inadequately distancing. So they just made it so people can't even drive there so that there's more space for pedestrians, which is great. And then this morning I was looking at Instagram, my friend Jennifer Lee, this is Jenny Aitley, who used to be a reporter for the New York Times, posted, I'm trying to remember which park this wasn't in New York, John, maybe you would actually know. I feel like it might've been Brooklyn. It was a park where there were little circles that were kind of parking spaces for people within a park so that they would socially distance. And this made a lot of sense to me because I was kind of like, I think, if I, like, for example, like if I saw Whitney, like I haven't seen Whitney in like months. And so like the muscle memory is like, oh, it's my friend, I'm gonna hug him. And like, I just don't have the practice. And so it's interesting to see government coming into these public spaces and making marks for us to stand on, almost like we're about to be in a play together, like a grand play in public space. Do you know the park that I'm talking about?
I don't know which one you're speaking of, but I've seen those things. They have markers throughout Central Park, which it usually says, this is 6 feet. And it looks a lot bigger when you see it. And you think, oh God, I don't think a lot of people are observing this. And actually, I've found that Central Park is of the parks I can go to in Manhattan, it's the worst. You know, all those bicyclists with $9,000 carbon fiber bikes, you know, who are training as if they're in the peloton for Tour de France, go zipping by, you know, 6 inches from you, and you think, you have a whole double-sized roadway that you're on. You know, doing this is too much. And
Yeah.
I think one of the metaphorical civic actions that takes place in parks is that you have to engage in kind of a give and take, and especially now, a sense of protection against yourself towards another person. You know, I've had the virus and I am theoretically immune, but I also know that people don't know I've had the virus. And so running close to them is going to make them upset. So don't do that is a kind of normal thing.
You have a couple of poems that are specifically about the way that public space is created, you know, taking us back to what you were saying about Paris. I wonder if you can read Unfinished for us.
Oh yeah. I found that fascinating because I went into this park, like all parks, ignorant. You know, I just sort of thought, oh, trees, pebbled lawn, you know, a fountain. And then I realized, you know, there was a lot of history there, that the park was several hundred years old. It was built by a woman who married into the royal family in France because of her money, and had to leave, you know, because her husband had been killed, and who had built this park as out of nostalgia for the Pitti Palace where she grew up in Florence. And that basically we were living in a kind of denatured dream home of a woman who, you know, did her best to write her own destiny in her time. And so I tried to grab some of those details and put them into this poem, which takes a bit of poetic liberty, but it's basically true. And it's called Unfinished. And it's about Mary de Medici. She never saw it completed, did not glimpse the many varieties of tortoises that lounged in a pond near the North Gate, never peered into its vast fish pool, never lowered her voice upon stepping into the metal room, her son's decoration shimmering in its ambition. She, being a woman, had to move in while the making was still being made. 1625, interiors, sawdust and silk, mornings padding across cold marble floors past footmen clicking their heels together. The arc of her life there for all to see in 24 Rubenses, girlhood, motherhood, widowhood. How they resented her, the French, but needed her money. She would have to commission her own story. She just needed more time. But time knows when it is being chased. The cardinals and ministers did not even hide the whetstone. They would eat her. Sailing to the Spanish Netherlands, banished to Belgium. Did she know that she'd never see her beloved park again? Or did it occur to her, finally, she could never replace time with more time? Even a third of a century building was not enough to return her childhood for a moment. So she gave her park to her son, the second son, in the full throes of his dukedom, an expert in acquisition. He'd never understand the only things that matter are irreplaceable. And then the palace began to tumble through the ages, each exchange erasing what it was meant to replace, developers nibbling at its margins, Napoleon ripping up her fountain, urban planners stuffing its walks with statuaries, 100,000 kisses exchanged in its shadows every spring. Even the Nazis in 1940 passed through, and the Luftwaffe said, "This will do." It's sleeting today, winter. The park glistens in its blanket of cold. By noon, the snow will be gone, an easy embrace to refuse.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I mean, Marie de Medici, you know, is a bit of a tragic figure in that poem, but she's not exactly, you know, poor.
No.
And, you know, I was thinking a lot when I read that poem and in other places in the collection about this connection between public space and wealth. And why are so many of our public spaces created by the wealthy? Is it just because that's who has the land? Is that the only way it can be done? I
Yeah.
wondered if you thought about that.
Yeah, I have a poem in my first collection about Wimbledon. Um, the common there was owned by royal families and then sort of landed wealthy families, and it was opened up to the plebes, as the city changed and expanded, and all the grand stately homes nearby needed cobblers and cooks and tailors and people to attend to the needs of a wealthy household. And those needs built the roadways, which invited people to move closer, which in turn created the need for space. And so people gave up some of their own private space. The Queen in England owns much of the land of the Greenbelt, and so the citizens or anyone passing through Britain is allowed to go and visit, Richmond Park, but the Queen technically owns it, I think. And such is the case all over the world. And France is interesting, especially Paris, because Napoleon at one point told all the dukes and landowners in Paris, like, you got to open your parks. And suddenly, in a very short period of time, these giant areas of urban green were opened to the rest of the world. And
isn't that easement? Isn't that what that poem is about?
That's what that poem is about.
Yeah.
And, Kipling and others came to Paris in this time and were marveling at the fact that, everyday people could sit in a park that was really designed for the extreme 1% of 1% and take their leisure. And right now, I think in our country, we're in one of those peak moments of consolidation of resources and wealth. It's astonishing how much is being grabbed and put into the hands of the very, very small. And so I decided in this moment to write about a park, because it seems to me that it's about time we created some more parks, if not actual, then metaphorical. And Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, whose wealth has gone up by 24 billion in the last 2 months, they can afford to create public space where people who aren't their customers, who are just simply citizens of or residents of a place, can go and take a load off.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reading what he's on pace to be the first trillionaire, but which is pretty.
You have to wonder if that's one of his goals.
I guess it must be, right?
Well, you can't spend it.
Right. What are you going to do?
Buy a planet? I don't know.
Buy every independent bookstore? Like, I don't even want to go there. On a happier, or like in a different vein, maybe as a counterpoint to the idea that parks are created by the wealthy, you also write a lot in this collection about the ways that animals think about space as compared to people. This is something that we've been interested in. We've talked to a few different guests about this, and I think it's fascinating. Your opening poem does this. Could you read that poem for us?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In the last couple of years, I've read some books that have kind of centered nature. Richard Powers' novel obviously is one of them, but there are other ones. And I found it very strange spending a lot of time in this park thinking, the park doesn't know I'm here. The park has no conception of me as a human or as a citizen or as an American or as anything. There are just a bunch of forms of natural life around me going about their days. And I thought about that, and just reminded me that we're kind of in the species realm. The humans are, we're like the 1% of the 1%, and what we claim dominion over. And so this is called the sacrifice. The difference between animals and us, the main one, is they don't need to know it's a park. The coyote lopes through just the same, looking for food. We stop in mourning, sensing everything we've lost. We call that ceremony a park.
And that's not the only time that the freedom of animals comes up. In the poem Open All Night, you write, when there is no hawk falling like a blade, no wolf loping into view, no marmot nosing the cracks in what we made of its pavement, we are lonely and ashamed. So it seems like you have in the space, actually, like, we require the animals to be there in a certain way. But is that the way I should be reading that? Is that way you're thinking about it, or some other way?
Yeah, I've always read the story about the Garden of Eden as, in a different way than I think maybe some literalists read it, and that it's not knowledge that creates shame. To me, it's the way that knowledge is used to create a separation between us and the other forms of life that are share this planet with us.
Oh,
Because
that's funny because I was explained to me as like, please don't have sex with people. That was the way it was explained to me.
yeah, I grew up Protestant too, and I had that period, and then I thought, this is not useful, and actually, how do I know that this is, maybe it's just don't pick the fruit. Literally, maybe it's literal. Like it's not don't have sex, just don't pick that fruit. That's my fruit. I'm making a pie.
I would
on
have
the weekend.
preferred that to be the lesson.
Oh my
Other than I
God.
think the don't have the sex lesson was a pain in the ass at the time.
It's always interesting to be the person on this podcast who read the Bible mostly in hotels. In another place you write, a park's purpose is to temper the machine in us, which is a really interesting idea. I wondered how that idea might be in tension with the other common denizen of the park, which is transient folks, the homeless. Is it good for public spaces like parks to, quote, temper the machine in us if part of that tempering means that there are parts of humanity that it's easier for us to ignore or unsee?
I think those are really troubling dynamics, and I'm glad you asked me about them because I believe that parks can be a very good influence on our lives, but not only if they become decoration or Instagrammable moments of sort of nature as a form of lifestyle meditation, and one of the things a park resists, I think, fundamentally is the notion that everything is usable or fungible. You can apply to a park the idea that a park is useful because it is somehow relaxing. But in reality, we live in a world in which time is commodified. Our labor has been commodified to a level that it's almost abstract. So a transient or a person without a home, a person without a job is triply expelled from the notions of society. Whereas many of the people who don't feel uncomfortable in a park or who feel entitled to be there have busy jobs which have taken up most of their time and are carrying probably in their pocket a sort of leash to their daily work as a reminder that they should be continuing to be a functionary of whatever business world that they're in. And so a park can be, I think, an enlarging wedge in that moment, and that it can bring together people who are working hard, possibly, or just constantly, with people who have no work, to make us realize that we do share in one fundamental thing, which is that no one should be entirely defined by their ability to be a functional aspect of a labor-driven society, which is then pushing that value of labor up into the hands of a few.
So we want you to read a poem, one last poem that's not about parks, but is excellent nonetheless and has an amazing word in it. And it made us think about our current president. And it will help us transition, I think, to talking about the anthology. Could you read Wait for us?
Wait. What if each time you caused pain, a small round stone were put in your pocket? Pebbles for inducing self-doubt, osmium for death. When you heard someone approach, their pockets noisy, you'd know, just as dogs do, to keep distance. Some men would pull wagons behind them, their pants disfigured. They'd be shamed from sidewalks, delayed at customs. They could never lie flat on beds. They'd have to stand, feeling the weight of what they'd done.
Thanks. Osmium is not a word that I have encountered before. And I didn't look it up before the show. What does it mean?
This is an extremely heavy element.
Oh, cool. All right. So all of us pulling our wagons of extremely heavy elements, wagons of osmium, could easily appear in the two previous Tales of volumes that you've edited, Tales of Two Cities, which details income inequality in New York City, and then Tales of Two Americas, which I was lucky enough to have an essay in, which examines income inequality on the national level. Your newest book, Tales of Two Planets, looks at global income inequality in the context of the climate crisis. So why the climate crisis? And why now? And what are you going to do next? Tales of Two Universes, Tales of Two Solar Systems? You're getting bigger and bigger.
No, traveling around with you actually in some cases. One of the things I noticed in talking about Tales of Two Americas was how much the climate crisis was a big part of what was driving inequality here. That many people that were coming into the United States from South America and Central America were leaving a dry corridor where they could no longer farm. And they were coming to the United States for economic possibility. And similarly, there were zones in Louisiana and Florida where homes that people had built and lived in were no longer sellable because of the changing and rising sea tides.
Hi, Tahmima.
Hi, Sugi.
I'm
Hi,
so happy
John.
to see you.
Hi, Dylan, who I can't see.
We must do formal introductions. We are lucky to have two old friends with us today. And Tahmima Anam, who is also one of the writers in the Climate Anthology, is joining us today to talk about her work. And she was born in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and she was selected as a Granta Best of Young British Novelist 2013. Her first novel, A Golden Age, was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award and the Costa First Novel Award, was the winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best First Book. Her second novel, The Good Muslim, was shortlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and also longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize. Her latest novel, The Bones of Grace, was published in 2016. Her columns have also regularly appeared in the New York Times and The Guardian, and she lives in London. Tahmima, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sugi.
Hi. It's so great to have you here. A little context for our listeners. Tahmima and I went on book tour a bunch together in 2008, which was huge fun. And we're in at least 3 countries together. And
I miss it, and it feels like a completely different world.
it seems like it. I guess it's, now we're reunited the 4th way via Zoom. So it's really wonderful to see your face. We've just been talking about John's poetry collection and also the anthology. And I wonder if you could start us off by reading your piece from it.
I would be very happy to. You'll forgive me. I don't have a printer at home, and I'm going to have to read it off my computer. So if my eyes are kind of wandering everywhere, that's why. It's a very short story essay, basically about how embarrassed I was as a kid, how embarrassed I was to come from Bangladesh. And yeah, so that was my childhood. It's called The Unfortunate Place. Should I just dive in? Yeah, I'll just dive in. Okay, The Unfortunate Place. Once upon a time, there was a girl from a terrible country. The country was battered by the worst combination of natural and human-made disasters: floods, cyclones, famines, war. The country was small and the people were poor. Every bad thing that could happen to a place would happen to that country. When she was 7, she and her parents left the terrible country and moved to New York City. Her parents enrolled her in the UN school, which was called Eunice. At Eunice, the students were invited to take pride in where they came from. "What are you most proud of?" her teacher asked. The Australian boy said kangaroos. The Kenyan boy said Kip Keino, the marathon runner who had won Olympic gold in Mexico and Munich. When it was the girl's turn, she had difficulty coming up with anything. Everyone still remembered that Henry Kissinger had once called her country a basket case, and that the image on the record of a famous charity concert for her country was of a starving child. "Longest beach in the world?" she offered weakly, pointing to a photo of a scruffy stretch of gray-brown sand. Sometimes other children would ask her whether they had roads in her country, and what she did when floods and cyclones arrived. She had herself not witnessed either of these catastrophes, as her grandparents' house was on the edge of a lake that swelled in the monsoon and dried up in winter as it always had. When the girl grew up, she attempted to make peace with this terrible country. "It's not so bad," she told herself. "It's maybe, on the scale of things, somewhat unlucky." But people often asked her the same questions about the floods and the cyclones. Then the world realized that something awful was about to happen to the entire planet. It was called, in turn, climate change, climate crisis, and then climate catastrophe. To her chagrin, the girl realized that her country happened to be unfortunate in this regard as well. Because it was located on the edge of the sea and made up of low-lying delta, when the sea rose, which it inevitably would, it would eat her country first. On the front lines of climate change, they called it now, because the world was different and basket case would have sounded too cruel. As time went on, however, the girl came to realize that because of all the terrible things, her people had the ability to see into the future. In the terrible country, climate catastrophe had already happened. All the storms that would batter the rest of the world had already appeared on her coastline. The floods and the droughts and the cyclones, they were used to those. They had built shelters and learned to irrigate lands in unusual ways. They were people who were used to living with uncertainty, with a kind of expectation of disaster that the rest of the world would eventually have to adapt to. In a world divided between those who knew and were therefore prepared for what was about to happen, and those who did not, her country was finally, possibly, a little bit lucky. One day at her son's school gates, a parent introduces her father. The father is a publisher, and the parent thinks, since the girl, now a woman, is a writer, they might have something to say to one another. Bangladesh, the man announces. I call that the unfortunate place. She smiles. But we know things that you will have to learn the hard way, she thinks. If she could speed back in time, she would have her younger self say to that class, resilience. In the face of all that is terrible, resilience.
Well, thank you for that, Tahmima. That was fantastic. You've been writing about climate change for more than a decade now and really spotlighting Bangladesh's unique position. How has your thinking and writing changed over time? I mean, that story is in some ways about how your thinking and writing about this issue has changed over time. And what was the moment that you conceived of that piece itself?
I mean, I had a lot of trouble, as John will attest to. He kind of was trying to persuade me to write something. I kept saying, no, I don't have anything intelligent to say. The first time I ever wrote anything about climate change was a very small piece in the New York Times. And it was more than 10 years ago. And the conversation has changed significantly since then. It used to be something that only environmentalists and activists really talked about as something that was definitely going to happen. In Bangladesh, people talk about it as something that, you know, there's a mass amount of migration from the coastal areas to the city. Every year, millions of people migrate because their land is literally disappearing. So it hasn't felt for a long time that it's a possible future. It has felt like it's a real present. So it's just kind of bringing those two narratives together. One of a place where it has already happened, and another where people have slowly come around to the idea that this is an inevitability. And it's not something that's going to happen in several generations. It's something that's going to happen in our lifetimes.
When I hear that story, I was, of course, thinking of my own quote unquote unfortunate place and the ways in which so much of what you describe feels also somewhat Sri Lankan. And like Bangladesh, right, these places are not considered part of the global north. And in your story, you challenge the idea that the global north is adequately prepared to tackle the climate crisis, harder to say than you would think, when compared to other countries. So how did you come to think of Bangladesh as a place of resilience? Like, how did you get beyond that shame to sort of see the resourcefulness that's there? Because I think I also see this in Sri Lankan communities where, like, as you say, like, this isn't a surprise. How did you kind of get around your own viewpoint there?
I mean, I think the reality is that if the climate crisis unfolds in the way that all the scientists are telling us it's going to unfold, no amount of resilience is going to help the people in places like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. That's just a hard kind of scientific reality. Having said that, I think, Bangladesh has been for many years a kind of laboratory for certain kinds of innovation. If you think about microcredit, or if you think about the first treatment for cholera, it happened in Bangladesh. And it's because it happened so kind of like, in the most kind of extreme way there, that other countries couldn't help but learn from it. So innovations came out of desperation. And I think there are certain kinds of innovations in like agriculture or disaster preparedness or whatever that we can learn from. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what all of those things are, but I was trying to kind of pull back from the story of the unfortunate, a story of resilience. And I feel a little bit conflicted about it, because I think ultimately we have to accept that there are certain realities that cannot be ignored. And that is not to say that, oh, don't worry, the people of Bangladesh, they're used to like really shitty things happening to them, so they'll be fine. Let's not worry about them. On the other hand, I think it's not just a simple story of victims and non-victims.
Yeah. John, I'm curious for your thoughts about this, because, countries in the global south have already seen the scars of the climate crisis. When you were curating the anthology and thinking about, the writers in the anthology are presented within the frame of the countries that they're from. How did you think about how you wanted to frame the anthology, and which authors and nations really needed to be included there?
That's a good question, because Tahmima, you've moved around in several nations, and several other contributors. Suleiman Adonia, comes from Eritrea and 4 other nations. And in his piece, he's writing about how he came to teach a workshop in helping refugees tell their stories, and what that means when your body has physically fled for its own safety to another space. Your body becomes a kind of story in situ, in a way. And so in putting this together, I didn't want any kind of nationality to be a baseline unit for selfhood, because I think that is one of the problems that is continuously gumming up the works of having any kind of enlarging discussion about how to live in a world where people are going to migrate for reasons of economic need, for political safety, for physical safety, to escape gender persecution, all kinds of things. And as Tahmima mentioned, 50 to 200,000 people a year are leaving Bangladesh as well and going elsewhere. And what kind of world is that, where we think people cannot be accepted if they're fleeing actually just for life and limb?
Do you remember the "We Are the World" thing that happened? When was that? Was that in the 80s or was that the 90s? I can't remember. That it was like raising money, right, for hunger. I think that what that was.
Yeah, it was like Bono.
Yeah.
It was that concert.
Yeah, but really what it was, that song wasn't really "We Are the World." The song was like, "We are so rich, and we're gonna have a concert and give a bunch of people who are poor and their lives are terrible, we're gonna help them."
Well, yeah, there's a line in that says, "Well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you." That is a line from that song. So
exactly, and the ethic of that song is very much the ethic of America for most of its history. And I think that part of what we're talking about now, and part of what I think you're trying to get at, Tahmima, in your essay, and we'll just maybe wrap up here, and John's doing with this anthology, is that that's not going to be an attitude that's going to work for us anymore, because we blew it, and maybe that's okay, and maybe that blowing it is part of us rejoining the world in a more useful way.
Think of the last scene in Black Panther, when he gets up in front of the UN and he says, "We're going to give you this gift." And some white diplomat is like, "What could Wakanda possibly have to give to us?" And every person who comes from one of those countries that is imagined to be a country that is only a victim and has nothing to contribute, just felt this like swell of joy at that last scene. I don't know if you did, Sugi, but it really stays in my mind, I mean, like, yeah, that's me. Don't ignore the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to do here is dismantle the language of American exceptionalism. the day after Trump was elected, I think what I did was write to all the Sri Lankan left activists I knew and sort of be like, if you have any advice for me right now, I would really love to hear it. And
How
I
to
think,
hate your leader.
I mean, and so, but sort of the practice of daily resistance that they have cultivated, right? It's so much based in those small actions. And, John, you used the word local, which I feel like is becoming more and more important. For our listeners, I just applied for my absentee ballot, and I hope that all of you do too. That seems like local action number one. And, and maybe another thing that I would encourage all of our listeners to do is to pick up this fantastic anthology, which I think is really important right now for us to think about how we can repaint those lines. And John and Tahmima, thank you so much for joining us. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really great to see all of you from a distance.
Be well.